Well, good afternoon. My name is Mike Snelly. I'm an extension specialist professor in the Department of Horticulture and Landscape Architecture here at Oklahoma State University, Stillwater. Welcome back to the Shackelford Lecture Series, or welcome if it's your first time tuning in this year, and for that matter, last year in 2021. And speaking of that, if you've missed any of the talks in the past and you didn't realize they were posted, my colleague Donna Dollins has done a great job keeping up with the now pretty voluminous library of YouTubes that we started in January of 2021, which ranged from anywhere from growing greenhouse tomatoes to invasive plants, and then today's lecture on Provenance matters. I want to recognize Linda Shackelford and the late Charles Shackelford for their ongoing support, for supporting or underwriting this series and all the other forms and means of support that they've given me and my colleagues at OSU easily over the last 30 years. So thank you, Linda, for always standing behind us. Our speakers today are Steve Bieberich and Kadin Bieberich from Sunshine Nursery, Clinton. And Steve Bieberich is owner. Kadin is at this point third or fourth generation nursery person in the business. And Kadin's dad, Adam, also is part of Sunshine Nursery. I don't know that he'll necessarily be featured today, but I certainly wanted to recognize Adam. I also want to recognize Steve Bieberich's wife, Sherry Bieberich, who's helped me a great deal over the last several decades as well. They all have. Speaking of in-kind support, monetary support, always there to give me advice and help me along the way for a long time now. So thank you to all the Bieberichs that are tuning in now or listening later. And just a note about Steve Bieberich particularly. Steve has traveled throughout the United States, but particularly in the Western United States, to find us the best plant materials that can really endure Oklahoma conditions, in this case, particularly Western Oklahoma conditions which can be quite challenging, as we all know, quite different from central, eastern Oklahoma, southern Oklahoma, and other parts of the U.S. for that matter. And that's going to tie in and make sense when they, Kadin and Steve, begin in a minute to talk about Provenance matters. Steve has also traveled in parts of Asia, and that too has flavored his thinking, I think, on Provenance and other matters that are perhaps relevant to their lecture today. And just on a whim, and I didn't give Kadin or Steve notice on this, but I was thinking, it'd be fun if even for 5 minutes for them to comment on their unfortunate flooding event, because Steve, I remember you writing or texting me earlier this year saying thought that was probably the worst flooding, as I recall, that you've ever encountered out in Clinton. I know you've been out there for many, many decades. So I'd love to hear about, I think we would all learn from you, both of you gentlemen, on the maybe some of it's obvious, probably not all that's obvious, on the fallout from the flooding event and what it's meant to you as nursery people, and lessons learned and stuff that you can anticipate for the next round, God forbid. But anyway, on that note, thank you both. And I'd like to, at this time, turn it over to Kadin Bieberich and Steve Bieberich, Sunshine Nursery. Welcome, gentlemen.
Well, hey, I appreciate it, Mike. I really thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today. I want to also thank the Shackelfords for their kind support of horticulture in Oklahoma. And just to start off, I'll mention our flood. It was the biggest flood event we've had I've been here almost 50 years on this property, and water went where it's never gone before and caused a lot of damage, knocked over lots of trees and terrible debris, and it hasn't rained since. And I can remember as a young man, my dad would talk about the drought of the 30s, and then he would tell about a terrible flood. I believe it was in 34. And I'd always say, well, how did you have a flood when you were in a drought? And now I know it rained a whole lot in a few hours and flooded us out, and then it hasn't rained since. So it's been a real challenge, but we've been able, with my son and grandson, we've able to get things planted back and stood up and repaired and cleaned up. And now we're looking for a rain. But well, look, I want to visit with you about provenance matters. And first of all, when I'm talking about provenance, really what I mean is where does the genetic material for a particular plant, a tree that you're going to use in your landscape come from? And it doesn't necessarily mean it has to come from the outline, the shape of Oklahoma or from the Southern Great Plains. It means, does the genetic material of a particular tree come from a climate and a soil and all the environmental things that's like where you're going to plant it? And I'm going to share with you a few examples that we've ran onto over the years. And I'll start out with, well, for instance, ball cypress. When Sherry and I first started to grow trees, we wanted to grow ball cypress. It's a beautiful plant. And we would get seed, mostly came out of the southeastern part of the United States. And we'd grow the little seedlings, and seemed like in our air root prune system, they did pretty well. The pH of that soil was usually around neutral to a little acidic, and they did fine. But once we put the ball cypress that the seed came from the southeast in our soil here in western Oklahoma, and by the way, our pH is about 8.3, which is really alkaline. What we would notice is they'd turn yellow, they'd not grow very well. As the summer got hotter, they would kind of turn black at the tips, and basically in 2 or 3 years, they'd just be a little ugly tree. And so we almost just gave up growing them because it's just not something that was going to perform for us. And I was just happened to be down in the hill country of Texas one time there's 3 rivers, the Lalandi, the Frio, and the Guadalupe rivers down in the hill country. And I noticed giant ball cypress, some of them with, the trunks were 5 and 6 foot thick, and they were growing right out of pure limestone. And the pH down there is much like the pH we have. And so I was pretty intrigued. And so we gathered some seed, we brought them home and grew populations of them. And it was amazing. They just really performed well for us. I actually sold some to a nurseryman in Oklahoma City, and he planted a row of what we call Frio ball cypress. And that's really not a particular name. That's just referring to, they came from the Frio River in central Texas. But he planted a row of our ball cypress. And at the same time, he planted some liners that he'd gotten in Arkansas. And in 3 or 4 years, he shared a picture of those ball cypress side by side, and his ones that came out of the southeast were yellow and stunted and only about 1/3 the size of the Frio that he'd got from us. And ours were, most of them were 3 to 4 inch caliper and just full dark green fluffy foliage. And so that's one of the examples that when I'm talking about provenance is really important, because we really wouldn't be able to grow that particular species if it wasn't for knowing a good seed source. And the fact that the Frio rivers and the Guadalupe rivers down in the hill country have high pH soil, they have a lot of hot, dry summers, and a lot of the same type of conditions that we have here in western Oklahoma. So it's proven to be a real good thing. Now, there's other considerations. Now, you'd think, well, that came from quite a bit further south. And so are you worried about cold hardiness? And that's certainly something that you have to take into consideration. Fortunately, the Frio from the hill country of Texas, I've got them growing as far as northern Nebraska, and they're still fine. But some species you can't move very far out of their hardiness zone without having problems. But so that's kind of what I'm talking about when I talk about provenance. It's kind of where the genetics, where that tree evolved, what type of climate and soil and conditions it evolved in. When we went to China and Tibet and places, that's certainly not western Oklahoma, but a lot of the areas that we went to had the same type of soils, the same cold, the same pH as we do here in Western Oklahoma. And I remember years ago, back in the 70s, that Dr. Whitcomb, he had a map upstairs in the barn there at OSU where his office was, and it showed the map of the world, and he showed where there's parts of China that had conditions much like we do here in Oklahoma. So that's something that's always stuck with me, and it's proven true that a lot of the Asian trees that we grow here come from parts of China that have the same soil and climate that we experience here. Another good example of a tree that provenance matters is just plain Shumared oak. And I'm sure all of you that have anything to do with trees are familiar. That's a highly recommended type of red oak for Western Oklahoma. And but we found out that if you really look at red oaks, they grow natively from just around East Central Texas, around say the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and they kind of grow northeasternly up kind of through the cross timbers through Oklahoma, Missouri, and they kind of wind up even up in southern Indiana. And what I've found that if you get seed from red oaks, Shumared oaks, maybe out of Missouri or Ohio or someplace in the east part of their range, and plant them here in Western Oklahoma, they do all right. They're alive, but they're never as green and as lush and as successful as if you got the seed closer to where you're going to grow them. And so we found out that there are Shumared oaks growing right on the very western edge of their range. Matter of fact, there's even some little pockets. There's a small pocket of Shumared oaks in Custer County on Deer Creek. And then over about the 107 mile marker on I-40, there's some big canyons that come into the Canadian River there, old red shaly soil, and there are Shumared oaks that grow there. And fortunately, there aren't any other red oaks in that region, so there's no chance of hybridization. And if you get that seed and produce Shumared oaks, they do excellent here. We never see chlorosis in it. We never see any problems with heat or drought stress. They just are super trees. And I've also found that even though they are from the western edge, you can move that tree further east and it still seems to do fine. But if you go way over in eastern Oklahoma and get a Shumared oak and bring it out to Elk City, it's not going to be near as happy. And so that's another example of how the provenance, where the genetics develop, they kind of evolved to be able to tolerate the climate that we have out here. And so what that's done for me is just really made me stop to think and look at a lot of the tree species that we have and see if there are some differences that we can use to make a better tree. And for example, one of them is not a native, it's the Asian tree. It's called Chinese pistache. And you think, well, how does that have anything to do? Well, pistache in China basically grows in a warmer area than it here in Western Oklahoma. So in other words, pistache is really more of a zone 7 tree. And when I first got in the business, I ordered seed way back in probably 1980. I ordered some seed from a company in California and got some pistache seed. And we grew the little trees out and lined them out. And then we had the cold winter of 1983. All of them died, all of them but one. I think there's one left. And I was pretty discouraged because I had seen pistache in Stillwater and thought that they were kind of a neat tree. And Paul Mitchell, one of past extension horticulturists from OSU, really, he was highly in love with pistache. And so that made me think, well, now something's going on here. So then I realized that there were plantings of pistache in Wichita, Kansas, and doing some research and looking back, I think pistache were probably first introduced to the United States in the like 1910s, or very early. And what's taken place here is they introduced pistache, and I'm sure some of the USDA people planted them. Nurserymen would probably get a hold of the seed and plant them, and they would do fine until we would have a real cold winter. And then they would, much of them would die, or they'd have a lot of big freeze cracks and go down. But out of each cold experience, there would always be that small number, maybe sometimes maybe just 1%, that lived, that didn't seem to be hurt by the cold. Well, over time, those trees would go ahead and mature, and researchers and nurserymen and people and birds would grow seedlings from them, and they were a little bit more cold hardy. Now, that doesn't mean they were all cold hardy, but they had developed out of the most cold hardy trees. And so basically in a little over 100 years, we have pistache now that are 2 zones more cold hardy than what you'll find in China. So we never brought any new germplasm for Chinese pistache back, because I really felt that we already had way more cold hardy pistache in Kansas and Oklahoma than you'll find in China. So that's another kind of a provenance things, where they came from and how natural selection has worked on them. That's just the survival of the fittest. The ones that could take the cold are the ones that's lived to continue on. So that's another good example of the genetics. And I know a lot of nurserymen, they don't like to hear me talk about this, because they really want to just get some trees and grow them up and sell them to you. And I've wanted to be in business, and I'm real proud that I've got my son and my grandson that's going to be taking over the nursery. And so I want them to have plant material that we can kind of feel pretty good on, that's going to take all the rigors that they will have in Western Oklahoma. And for instance, we'll talk also about Caddo sugar maple. Now, Caddo is just a sugar maple. We call it Caddo maple because Caddo and Canadian counties is where we find that subspecies. I think the taxonomists call it Acer saccharum, variety saccharum. And what it really is, at one time, sugar maples covered a whole lot of Oklahoma. And over the eons, as the great forest have kind of receded back towards the east, and we've become more dry prairie, there were some sugar maples that kind of got stuck in some of those deep canyons in Caddo and Canadian counties. And those particular trees usually were growing in real pretty sandy, dry conditions, but they were sheltered some by the canyons. But over the times, they've evolved to be tougher. Some researchers say they have a little thicker cuticle on the leaf, which makes them less problem with sun scald and leaf tatter. Plus, they can tolerate some really high pH soils. And subsequently, they've kind of become known as Caddo maples. Now, that's not a cultivar. It's grown from seed, so it's just a landrace group of trees. But they have proven to be excellent, and it's all about where the genetic came from that makes them so good for us. And they tolerate during the drought of 11, 12, 13, that real dry period we had. I could drive around Western Oklahoma and show you dozens of caddos that were absolutely beautiful. No effect by the drought, just big, beautiful green trees. And you could go in some people's lawns, and the Bermuda grass had all turned white, and you could stick your hand plumb up to your wrist down in the cracks, and the trees were fine. So what it amounts to is Caddo is more alkaline soil tolerant, more drought tolerant, more heat tolerant, more wind tolerant. It doesn't seem to be affected by deformities due to how sycamores and silver maples, the wind kind of blows them over and they kind of have a combed over look. Caddos tend to stay real symmetrical. Now, they also have maybe some negative things. If you if you take a Caddo and plant it in compacted, heavy clay soil with lawn irrigation and a drip system on it, you'll kill it. And we've had some problems with that, where landscapers would say, oh, we want to plant those, and they'd plant them in the wrong spots and overwater them, and they can't handle it. I think the fact that they evolved in this very loose, sandy soil, they don't have very much resistance to verticillium wilt. And so when they get put in a waterlogged, tight, over wet soil, verticillium will always take them out. And so it's a little bit of a challenge. You have to plant a Caddo and keep it watered enough to get it established. But once you get one established, they're pretty much on their own. And so that's another example of, where the genetics, how that plant evolved in the place that it's growing, that gives it traits that do well in our landscapes here. And here again, I can take Caddos to eastern Oklahoma, and as long as they're planted on a place that has good drainage and not in tight, flat, waterlogged soil, they do fine. I've got a friend in Tulsa that's got some beautiful Caddos, but they're in a drained location. And those are some of the examples that I can think of real fast. But over the years, I've looked at a lot of things like different lacebark elms, finding some that have more cold tolerance, have better, stronger wood and better branch connections. We've looked at hackberries that don't tend to have problems with nipple galls, and so all of that has to do with where the tree evolved. If you can kind of make it match your conditions. Kadin, can you think of anything else?
Fusiformis.
Oh yeah, that is the live oak, the Quercus fusiformis. That's we call it Quartz Mountain live oak. It's the live oak that occurs down at the Quartz Mountain, down around north of Altus and Blair. And you'll also find fusiformis. They list it down around Mineral Wells to Decatur. It's kind of a northern type of live oak. And Benny Simpson in his book said that it never got as big as southern live oak, but it kind of all depends on where you're growing it. I can take you down there on the mountains and get back closer to some of the river bottoms where it's not growing right in the wetland, but it's in better soil, and it takes 2 or 3 people to reach around the trunk. And so the deal with them is they're just more cold hardy. The fact that they are the northernmost group of live oaks, then they grow on into Oklahoma. They can tolerate the cold weather down to, well, we've been to 16 below 2 different winters since I've been in business, and 2 or 3 nights of that. And the only thing I can see is sometimes the live oaks will lose their leaves. The leaves will turn a little white when we get way down that cold, and they'll drop. And the next spring they leaf out all the way to the top, and they're fine. To where if you have live oaks that came from more central and south Texas or the southern United States, we get those real cold winters, you'll actually lose branches in the top. There's some that they'll live, but the whole tops might die out of them. So that's another example of just where they live in their range to see how cold hardy they are. And we have a Texas madrone that came out of New Mexico, and it certainly should not have survived all the years it has here. And it's just the fact that it came from about the coldest region in its native range. And so those are all examples of why that provenance, plays a importance.
Speak.
Yeah, Kadin just now, he has to keep me on the ball because I'm getting old and kind of senile. We have a type of Arizona cypress called Cook's Peak. And here again, that's not a cultivar. That's just a name that we've given to the seed source. And Cook's Peak it's one of the highest elevations in New Mexico. And a good friend of mine, Alan Taylor, who's quite a plantsman from Colorado, actually was up on Cook's Peak. I think he was actually collecting something else and noticed these Arizona cypress, and this is super cold area. And he brought seeds of them back to the Denver Botanical Garden, and Paniotti at the Botanical Garden grew them on, and they were completely successful, no damage whatsoever in Colorado. And so I was given seed, and we've grown some huge populations of that. It's kind of, there is some variations. There's some are a little bit more blue, some of them are a little bit more compact, some are a little bit more open. But basically what we're really looking at is cold hardiness, because some of the other Arizona cypresses, like one that I think it came from the East Coast, when they made a selection called Carolina Sapphire, it'll, you get down to 0, it'll lose its top. Blue Ice is pretty good, but I've seen some cold entry on it. And if you just grow seedling Cupressus arizonica, just Arizona cypress from seed, lots of those won't stand to go much below 0. And sometimes they won't kill them, but they'll just really hurt them. They'll like get a lot of kind of dead in them and look ragged. But the Cook's Peak has been completely cold hardy for us, and it's really a fast growing screen type evergreen, real pretty blue foliage, smells good. And so those are the type of examples of provenance matters that I've observed. And there's probably 100 more plants that I haven't even thought of today. And so if we got anybody with any kind of questions that they'd like to ask.
Any questions for Steve? I encourage you to throw them in the chat box. I'm looking here. I have some, Steve, but I'm going to make sure that I don't hog this till everybody else has asked their questions.
Okay, read that to me, Kadin, and I'll try to answer.
All right. It says, Steve, you got me interested in netleaf oak, Quercus rugosa, many years ago, and I've always wondered about the provenance and what could be, or what more could be done with this evergreen with work on geographic selections.
Well, Quercus rugosa is called netleaf oak, and it's a very beautiful tree. It's kind of a small, slow growing, very drought tolerant tree. The upper part of the leaf is kind of an olive green, and the back is real tomentose, real fuzzy, and it's kind of a golden, kind of a fuzzy back. Really an attractive tree. Your question about the provenance of that tree, that tree was the seed was given to me by an old friend named Logan Calhoun, and he collected it out of, I believe, out of Arizona. I'd have to go back in my records and look. The one tree I have here at the nursery has survived 2 winters that have got down in, the minus teens, and both winters it did make the foliage look somewhat rough, but it's always shed its leaves in the spring and leafed out and done fine. So the one I have seems to be cold hardy for my location. And I know Kadin's pretty interested in the visiting with the guys with the International Oak Society. And I think there's probably a whole lot of really good oaks out there that we need to go investigate. And rugosa would be another one of them. One that I didn't mention, I just now thought of, Quercus glaucoides, which is called lacy oak. It's a white oak, and it occurs down in the hill country region of Texas. And I really am enthused with it. We have a group in the tree field right now, and we've had, well, it's been the most terrible summer I ever remember. We rotor-tilled down there day before yesterday, and it was so dry and dirty that I'd have to stop to be able to see where I was going. Now, of course, we have drip irrigation on the tree itself, but in the middles, it's just absolute powder. But those lacy oaks all have new growth all over them, and they've done really well. I planted one behind my daughter's house, about a 2-inch, and it grew there a couple of years, and the gophers ate the roots on the 2 sides of it, and it almost fell out of the ground. And I thought, oh crap, that's terrible. But I kind of stood it back up, and that tree rooted back in and has done fine, and it's full of acorns this year. So lacy oak is another one that I feel like super nice. It's a smaller oak tree, so it's not going to get as big as a burr or a Schumer, but it has kind of a blue-green foliage, real kind of almost a blue foliage, and it has real small acorns, and it'll grow almost on any soil. Could you get me a drink of water? But
Hi, Steve. I have 4 lacy oaks planted at my house in Dallas in the prairie soil. We've experienced that same summer that everyone else has in the Midwest. I have 2 trees planted out on my parkway. I've watered them twice this summer, a good soaking, and they look fantastic.
well, I think they're going to be Lynn Lowry really promoted those trees a lot, and for some reason they never did really get popular here in Oklahoma. And I've grown some, and we grew a crop 3 or 4 years ago in the field, and they all sold, and people have enjoyed them. So I think it's be a tree that we really need to look at more.
Yeah, I agree, especially for small urban yards and projects. I'm a landscape architect, and I've specified them on projects a few times, and the contractors invariably come back and say, well, we can't find them. So hopefully some more people will start growing them.
Well, that's always been, I've been interested in unusual plants now my whole career, and it's always that same issue. You won't get a nursery to grow it until people ask for it.
Mm-hmm.
But if you grow it before they know what it is, then you're stuck with it. So it's a catch-22. And I just encourage landscape designers to continue to ask for things, even though they might not get them. But if they ask for them enough, nurserymen will finally say, well, there's been 2 or 3 people ask about that tree, so why don't we try to find out about it? So I think the fact that they are a little bit smaller tree, kind of a compact, and a lot of our houses now really don't have room for a giant red oak. So I agree that's super.
And the other thing, they're prolific cedars. Or I get saplings that come up every year, and I dig them, put them in 4-inch pots, grow them for a year or 2, and then give them away as gifts to friends. Then they plant them in their yards. But yeah, I get 10 good saplings every year.
I think that the fact that they do produce a good seed crop nearly every year would also make them a good wildlife plant, because I see the squirrels. We've got a tree in the back part of the arboretum, and I have to kind of fight the squirrels to get them. And it's been really interesting. Ordinarily, I don't save very many acorns here on my property because I have so many different species of oaks. But we occasionally will grow off a batch from some of our trees and just see how much hybridization we have. And the lacy oak evidently doesn't bloom at the same time as any of our other oaks, because we grew a crop 2 years ago, and there's not one sign of hybridization in that group. So sometimes you can get by with, we won't have to go to the hill country to get the seed. And was there any more questions?
Yeah,
Here's one
Steve,
here. It says,
go ahead, Kadin.
do the microflora in the soil make a difference? When a seedling from far away is really struggling, I wonder if it needs to partner with some soil organisms that didn't come along with the seeds.
Well, that's a good question. And I took some microbiology and when I was in college, but I've always wondered about that. And I've done a little bit of experimenting. I knew that for a while I was having trouble to grow Caddo maples. Back 40 years ago, we'd have trouble when we'd shift them into the last stage of growth. They just wouldn't look good. So I actually went down to the canyons and would gather leaf mold out from under the wild caddos and bring it home, and we would mix it in with our peat bark sand media, and we do some with added native soil that should contain the mycorrhiza that grows with the sugar maples, and some without. And really, I could never really tell the difference. Now, I do think that I've noticed this. When I'm taking a tree, a woodland tree, an oak or a maple or something that came out of a forest situation, and taking it to a new landscape, say like up at Woodward or Cheyenne, and putting it in a prairie location, where basically there hasn't been trees growing for a number of years. I have noticed this: when I take wood chips that are basically the ground up limbs from the arborist, the clear lines for PSO, it's just the chips that we have big piles of them. When I've mulched trees with wood chips that basically were just ground up trees of all varieties, I can tell it makes a difference. And I actually wonder sometimes if I'm not adding some fungus and bacteria that came from cellulose wood particles to that prairie soil that's really just had been growing grass. And so I might not be the best person to ask about the microflora, but I do think that it's important, and I certainly don't think it would hurt anything. And we also use pine bark in a lot of our artificial medias, and I'm sure that the fact that they've cut those trees in the forested areas and roll them around, and I'm sure they pick up some bacteria and fungi, but I'm really not an expert on that. Anybody else? My glasses, if I get back where I can read that, then I can't see what they say. Thank you.
Fran, you're Mike Snell here. You're welcome to unmute yourself if you want to talk to Steve more about mycorrhizae or any of the other organisms. I don't have the authority today to unmute you, or I would on the spot, or anybody else.
Okay. I just wondered about it, not so much about woody plants, but I've often noticed that when I try to move some native plants from the prairie into my garden, they don't do real well. Well, some of them do real well at first, right away, but others take a while, and then after a few years, they're just as happy as can be. And it occurred to me that maybe it took them a while to establish the partners that they need to be comfortable with. And if I just moved them straight in, they didn't have that community. So I wondered if it applied to woody plants as well.
Oh, I think it does. I think that the relationship with the microorganisms and the woody plant is really important. Now, it's a whole field of study, and I just know that we used to get bare root things in, and my father-in-law a lot of times would go out and get leaf mold from underneath trees and make a slurry and dip the bare root trees in them before we potted them. And most of them grew, but I think that's certainly a case. Now, like when you move wild plants from the prairie into your garden, there are some of the microorganisms still attached to the root system. So you're bringing along some of them, but it might take a while for the populations to build up for the plant to really be happy. And it could just be transplant shock. So.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Steve or Kadin?
Can you hear me?
Yes, Roger, go ahead.
What about the cedar elm in central Oklahoma?
Cedar elm is a tree that I am real fond of, and we grow cedar elm. Actually, I've produced even a cultivar, one we call Brazos Rim, which is we grew a lot of seed from down around Mineral Wells. It seems to be a lot of really beautiful cedar elms in that area. And one year I found one that was really a compact grower, and we named it, and there's plants of it at the National Arboretum. We also have one planted here at our nursery that has a really upright form. It's almost a kind of a big central leader tree. And I'm a big fan of cedar elm. And there is quite a bit of variation in where you get them. I think that any of them that grows in South Central, North Texas to Southern Oklahoma should be used more. And to me, they're every bit as good as a lace bark elm, and probably a little more sturdy. Now, there are a little bit of problems with elm leaf beetles. We see almost no feeding ever on lace bark elms, but on cedar elms, you'll have a little bit of feeding, but not enough to really completely defoliate a tree like they do on the Siberians. And I did a lot of work for quite a few years. We probably have, maybe 75 or 100 different types of elms and different varieties and species, and probably one of the biggest collections in the nation. And we've done surveys for elm leaf beetle feeding, and I always ranked them from 0 being no problem up to a 4, which is pretty well completely defoliated. And cedar elm would always get about a 1.5 to 2 as far as a little bit of feeding. It depends on how bad the populations of the elm leaf beetle is that particular year. And so by all means, I think it should be a tree that we use more of.
Thank you.
Now, Kadin just now said I could talk a little bit about Texas buckeye. It's an interesting little tree. It's called Aesculus glabra variety arguta, and you'll find it in Caddo and Canadian counties, growing in real poor, kind of impoverished sandy soil. And it's in the spring, it's really, really pretty. It has great big palmately compound leaves, almost look like a big marijuana plant, but then it opens a kind of a greenish yellow bloom, spike bloom, probably 6 inches tall. And it's a perfect little Keebler elf tree. It never gets, I think the state record of it is less than 15 feet. And tough as a boot, easy to grow. They'll take full sun or partial shade. And if there was something I was going to say negative about them, is that when it gets hot and dry, they will start to go dormant sometimes right, mid-July to early August. But they're smart. It's got hot. They're going dormant while they still can. And so this year they look pretty rough now. So the fact that they aren't attractive in the fall is the only negative thing. But as far as the first half of the year and their winter shape, they have such nice structure. They're such a cute little tree. They'll have a pretty good sized trunk and then a nice well-formed top. So it's a fun small tree.
Kadin, I don't know if you noticed, but one of our landscape architects, Connie Scothorn, just asked if she has a seedling from a Canardii or Taylor juniper. Well, it stayed true to the cultivar in terms of any future seedlings. And Connie, you're welcome to unmute yourself as well and jump in. But Steve, do you see or did you hear the question from Connie?
The question is that she has a seedling from a Canardi.
Or a Taylor, Will it come true? Will it come true?
No, not necessarily. The Taylor juniper, I'll talk about it first. It's really an interesting group of red cedars. We knew about the Taylor. It was actually found by a nurseryman named Wilkie in Columbus, Nebraska, way back in the early 50s. And he found this tree out in Taylor, Nebraska. I think that's in, it's in one of the Sandhill counties out western Nebraska. And he got scions at it and propagated it and was selling it, but it never really caught on. It was kind of a locally known in parts of Nebraska, and it never really caught on to be a landscape tree. Well, over the years, I would notice that there was areas of red cedars all around the United States. For instance, there are some around Edmond that are very tall and slim. There's some in Santa Claus, Illinois. There's some down by Fort Worth. There's a group at Hoistington, Kansas. There's another population in Endicott, Nebraska, which is way over in eastern Nebraska, that you just find a group of junipers that would be tall and slim. And then there's Taylor, and Taylor grows out in Taylor, Nebraska, and it's on a farm, and all of the junipers around it look just typical red cedars, just like an average. But there's one tree that's tall and slim, and that's Taylor. And we took scion wood off of Taylor in Taylor, Nebraska. And that same year, we gathered scions at 6 other locations around the United States that had tall, skinny red cedars. And we grafted them all onto Het's rootstock. And only the Taylor stayed slim. All of the other trees that we found that were a tall, skinny red cedar, all just became normal. They just look like a typical wild red cedar. So I don't know what makes Taylor unique and those other populations skinny, and they don't seem to hold it when we propagate them. And as far as growing a seedling from Taylor, Taylor is a female, but it doesn't set hardly any seeds. If you'll go up to an old Taylor, it's got a few seeds, but not very many. And most of them are infertile. Harlan Hammernick was a good friend of mine, a nurseryman in Nebraska. He did manage to germinate some seed off of a Taylor. And I think he had maybe, 20 to 30, and none of them stayed slim. They were all just cedar trees. So, and as far as Canardi is concerned, that is a female tree that's fairly known for being a heavy cedar, lots of beautiful silver berries. And I've grown seedlings off of Canardi. I know that's a sin, but I'm sorry, I did do it a time or two. But they all turned out to just be cedars. Didn't necessarily look like the parent. Does that kind of answer your question?
I want to thank you, Steve. I want to put in a plug for Connie. Connie Scothorn is lecturing on a panel discussion, Oklahoma Nursery and Landscape Association's trade show in Shawnee this year towards the end of October, 26th through 28th. So, and I'm hoping the Bieberich will be there as well, but we're going to talk specifically on native plants and some of the challenges of getting more natives into the landscape and what's the reality of when LA spec for them and yada, yada. But Connie's going to be one of our panelists. So please join us in Shawnee towards the end of October.
Well, I'd like to hear a presentation. We get a lot of calls from people that have, a lot of them are younger people that have got to be members of the Oklahoma Native Plant Society. And even today, Kadin was telling me about a lady who called and was wanting native plants, but she didn't want anything that was a cultivar. And that's just like if you have like I have a button bush that we call Sputnik. Well, all it is just a wild button bush that I gave a name to, and we asexually propagated. So just because it has a cultivar name doesn't mean it's not a native plant. And of course, I love native plants, and we've kind of, the foundation of our business is on native plants, but my definition of where native isn't really the boundaries of Oklahoma. It's more the area, the climatic and soil and weather parts of the United States that fit where I live. That's kind of native to me. So it would include parts of the Texas Panhandle and the hill country of Texas, and maybe as far east as I-35, and but some people are very rigid on Connie, what are you still listening? What's your definition on native? Does it have to be just in the shape of Oklahoma?
No, it doesn't. My definition of native is very liberal. If was originally native to the country and it grows well here, I call it native. But I kind of agree with that. In other words, it's more about plants that'll perform where you want to grow them more than the shape of the state of Oklahoma. And because if you really think about our state, you take from Tom, Oklahoma in McCurtain County to Kenton in Cimarron County, that's a tremendous amount of diversity as far as ecotypes. And Oklahoma has a super wide range of areas. And so I agree that it's more about the native to do with where the plant came from, if it's kind of like where you want to use it.
Thanks, Connie. And Steve, regarding the the nativar dilemma, which I'm hoping Connie and the rest of us can, and hopefully you that day and Shawnee can discuss. The research I'm looking at, more nativars than not are still being successfully accessed and used by our pollinators and our animals and such. You know, there's some where the proboscis can't reach them because they're very long and they've been messed with by geneticists and such. But I'm hoping when the jury finishes up that we're going to find that more nativars than not are eco-friendly for everybody, not just humans and our enjoyment, our eye candy.
Yeah, I agree. I think that certainly they'll be more friendly than something from some other world. So
Absolutely.
Kadin just now wanted me to talk about the Quercus bucklei and Quercus chamardii. You know, that whole group of trees is an interesting deal. Quercus bucklei is actually a oak that comes from the West Texas, out in the hill country, and it looks a lot like a Shumard. It's probably 20% smaller. The leaf is a little bit deeper lobed, and the acorns are a little smaller. It has excellent good fall color and very drought tolerant. And it tends to, as you go from the hill country of Texas, as you go further east, it starts to merge with Shumard. And so they're around Dallas-Fort Worth area. Some of the native oaks will look kind of about halfway between the bucklei and a Shumard as we know it here in Oklahoma. But then as you go further east, they tend to kind of merge with Nuttall's oak and kind of lose some of their drought tolerance and being able to grow in a little bit wetter soil. And so that provenance thing has to do with where it has merged with another species and taken on some of the traits, because the speciation, you know, that's just a man-made thing. We've put some parameters on, this is what a tree has to have to be this species, but it's a little bit deeper than that. It took me a long time when I first started to go out in the field and look at oak trees and to tell what species they were. It was hard. It took me a while to grasp the ability to know that there was species variation. Within a species, they didn't all have to look exactly the same. Because if you think that way, when you go out in the wild and look at oaks, it's really going to be confusing. But the bucklei, if you get it out of West Texas, it's really a nice tree. It's a smaller than Shumard. I think it's equally as good for Oklahoma, even central Oklahoma, as Shumard. I think it's a little smaller, a little bit more dependable red fall color, and we grow both. And we also have a individual that we sold some trees to that were hybrids, and occasionally we get acorns from him. So we even have some intermediates that are kind of in between Shumard and bucklei. All of them seem to do pretty well, as long as I don't get anything. You know, Mike Durr did a paper probably 20 years ago about Nuttall's oak and talking about how super it was, and it would grow in wet soils, and it was just good as ice cream. And so I thought, gee, I need an oak that'll grow in wet, swampy places. So I bought some Nuttall seeds out of Texas, definitely the right thing, and we planted them. And once we left the milk carton in the nursery and put them in the soil, they got smaller every year. They'd turn yellow and kind of burn back, and the next year they'd get smaller. So the ones out of East Texas didn't work for us at all. But the bucklei that comes out of West Texas, and that's very confusing because the taxonomists have changed the names. Texas red oak used to be what they called bucklei, and now Texas red oak is Nuttall's. And so if you go back in the literature and look at Robert Vines and look at Benny Simpson and Oaks of the Southwest, and you'll find that taxonomy and that common name thing really hard to figure out. But I understand it because I went and actually looked at the individual trees in the wild. But I highly recommend Buckley's oak from the hill country of Texas for Oklahoma. I think it does super well. I don't know whether it'll have the same disease problems. I haven't seen the disease problems in buckeye, but that doesn't mean anything.
Any other questions for Steve or Kadin?
Well, I'd like to kind of tell you all about my son and grandson. Adam has worked with me here in the nursery nearly his whole life, and he's extremely knowledgeable when it comes to plants. He's just he's not very comfortable with public speaking, but Kadin actually has a master's degree in engineering, and he's worked with his dad and I here at the nursery and gotten really interested. And I'm really proud of both of them wanting to hang in here and continue to produce trees and do landscapes and carry on the business. And I really encourage all of you to come and meet Adam and Kadin. I'm gonna hang around until they run me off, but it's really a pleasure to have both of them working here, and I'm kind of turning it over to them, and I think that we're going to have a lot of fun. Is there any more questions?
Any other questions before we wrap up? We've got plenty of time. Steve, the more I think about it, I really want you to make the journey over to Oklahoma City late October. We'd love, Connie and I and the rest of us that are on the panel would love to have you be part of that.
Well, I've been seeing the emails from the ONLA, and I told Kadin we ought to go to that. You know, I used to go to all those things, but I'm such a homebody that, and then, you know, I started doing things, and then we started having COVID, and that made us all kind of nuts. And so I've kind of thinking about that maybe, and but we'll try to come to that, and I think it'd be fun.
Yeah, there's just so much to discuss that day. So anyone else, you're welcome to unmic yourself. Don't be shy and speak up. Otherwise, we're going to wrap up. I appreciate everybody tuning in today. I want to thank again Kadin Bieberich and Steve Bieberich, and those behind the scene, which would be Adam Bieberich and Sherry Bieberich and the rest of the gang for helping us. Okay, it looks like Caitlin Gibson jumped in. Caitlin mentioned, Steve, we have 2 buckeyes in Stillwater planted in January 2021, and they're doing well. Caitlin, unmute yourself, Caitlin, if you'd like.
Caitlin, are those some that maybe that I brought up to you, or did you get them someplace else?
Hi, sorry, I just unmuted myself. But yeah, I think they came from you, so they're doing well, looking good.
I remember that load, and we brought you some buckeye up there. I think they're, you know, there's Paniotti, he's the head of the Denver Botanical Garden, and they have a buckeye there at the gardens, and it's an old tree. It's been there for years, and it's gorgeous. And he says that tree never fails to give them fall color. And in Denver, you know, they don't have very good fall color, so that's something they're always looking forward to. And so it's been the only problem is that you run into with this oak deal is most nurseries, big production nurseries, don't have the ability to go out and collect seed at the right place. And so they depend on seed collectors. And a lot of seed collectors really don't have a whole lot of knowledge on taxonomy, and they just go out, and if they find a tree and they think it looks like what you want, they just gather it up and send it to you. And so it's really tough. I know that I've had many opportunities to sell. If I wanted to just go out and collect seed and sell it, I could have lots of seed companies that would buy from me. But it's also, you know, you don't get seed every year. It's like Caddo sugar maple. They make a seed crop about every 3rd year, and then once in a while you're lucky enough to have 2 years in a row, but you don't see seed on them all the time. And so a lot of these oaks that and plants that we're recommending from their particular provenances it's hard for big nurseries to come up with the right seed every year. And so it makes me a little sad that there's not more old kind of ma and pa operations like we have here that can take the time to do that. And I think that's going to limit the availability of the right genetic material for people in the future. And I think it's really important that we continue to think about that and try to encourage, you know, if you can add value to a tree because it comes from a particular area that you know is going to do well for you, to me, it's a value added product. And so I think we need to encourage some of our bigger nurseries to spend a little bit more time doing that. Now, I know J. Frank Smith does a lot of selections of trees for particular ornamental characteristics, and they do a great job, man. They come up with some super neat plants. But when it comes to where will they grow, I don't think that it works as good. Like they produce John Pear sugar maple, which is a sugar maple that actually I gave Dr. Pear 40 years ago, and he planted it at the research station there in South Wichita. And it was kind of a dwarf. The tree never got very big, but it was absolutely the most dependable fall coloring maple that I've ever seen. I mean, it never fails to have good fall color. And Schmitz produces it, but they produce it on Eastern sugar maple rootstock. And so I don't find it performing as well because the rootstock, I think, is a part of the fact that it is tolerant to our area. So they've asked me to provide them with Caddo seeds so they could graft it, but I can't do it because I don't have Caddo seed every year, and they don't store well. And but we were able this year to actually take some true Caddo maple seedlings and graft some John Pear scions onto it. I don't think we have but a couple of dozen of them, but it's a super beautiful tree and almost a dwarf. And so I'm really looking forward to that. Kate and I are actually been thinking about some other ways to propagate some plants on rootstocks from Western Oklahoma that we know will tolerate our high pH soils and our heat and drought and wind and cold and hail, but actually put some plants that maybe are a little tenderer. For instance, the old Crimson King Norway maple, big, beautiful purple leaves, but they really don't like our heat and drought out here. But what if they could be put on to Acer truncatum rootstock, which Shantung maple tolerates our soil and heat really well, and they're both in the Platanoides group. We're going to actually try to maybe do some grafting where we can put a cultivar onto a rootstock that'll tolerate our conditions better. Does anybody think that's nuts? No comment.
It's got a nice compliment from Raylene Harrison, thanking you for your and Adam's talk today.
Oh, well, good. Thank you.
Also from Kelly Rada.
Well, look, I enjoyed visiting with you guys. This is kind of a new thing for me. I'm kind of old fashioned, so talking to a computer is not something I'm too used to. I talk with my hands a lot. You know, I've give talks to you, and I haven't got to use my hands very much, but it's been fun. I've enjoyed it, and I look forward to having everyone come see us, or we'll meet at Oklahoma City. Mike, thank you a lot.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Kadin. Everybody have a great day. We'll see you next month. Take care. Bye-bye.